Hello and welcome to Merlin's Manor. Today I'm going to be going over the major gameplay differences between Slay the Spire, the board game, and the original Slay the Spire video game. I'm not going to be going over specific card differences, but rather focusing on the general differences between the board game and the video game. As I mentioned differences, I'll be using the video game as the baseline, and so as I mention differences, I'll be referring to how the board game differs. I'll often specify this by stating when I'm speaking of the board game and when the video game, but sometimes to avoid being overly wordy, I may not specify by saying board game or video game. As I mentioned what is different, I'm referring to the board game being different. So let's get into these differences now. And the biggest difference between Slay the Spire, the board game, and the video game is the scaling between the games, as the board game is scaled back quite a bit. Health for characters is much lower, and so is damage that is done and the block that is gained. This is done to make calculations a lot easier. It also makes the board game a much tighter game, where losing a single hit point matters much more. In the video game, you can afford to trade health in order to do damage or prep for future rounds to a much greater degree. While you will do this to a degree in the board game, you cannot afford to lose health quite as freely, as losing hit points is more severe in the board game. In the board game, the starting health for most characters is 9, with the Ironclad starting with 10 health. And the Ironclad starting relic allows him to heal for 1 health in the board game, and resting at campfires allows players to heal for 3 health. Coins gained and costs are also scaled back for easier calculations. Now in the board game, weakness and vulnerability are lost when attacks happen instead of at the end of a round, which means multiple weaknesses or vulnerability can be used up in a single round. It also means that if no attacks are made, then weakness and vulnerability stay on characters between rounds instead of characters shedding a weakness or shedding the vulnerability there. Vulnerability also does double damage in the board game instead of just 50% more damage. There are also a maximum of 3 vulnerability or weakness tokens that can be placed on a given character. Speaking of maximums, there are caps for block, energy, and strengthen in the board game, which aren't in the video game. The maximum block is 20, the maximum energy you can have at a given time is 6, and the maximum strengthen is 8. The maximum on energy can also make pulling off an infinite combo a little harder, and in general it is actually quite a bit harder to perform an infinite combo in the board game. Many relics that activate on timers in the video game are instead activated by a die roll at the start of each round. This is done so that you don't have to keep track of how many cards are being played or other timing triggers, which makes the game run smoother than it would if players had to track all those things. But it does take some of the strategy out of the game for planning around those various triggers. It does have the benefit of being able to work towards having relics set up so that something triggers almost no matter what die number is rolled if you have enough relics with different numbers required to trigger them. And some relics even let you change the die result once per combat. The die roll will also randomize some enemy attacks, and you only do 1 die roll per round of combat, which determines all things that need a die roll to determine them for that round. The exception to this is the writhing mass that changes its intent each time you attack it. In the case of the writhing mass, you'll reroll the die for the enemy each time it is attacked. There are several other changes to various enemies. For example, the birds reduce all damage from attacks to 1. And for enemies that have a progression of intentions, you can see what they will be doing over the course of the game. There are other various minor adjustments to various enemies, but they all have a similar feel to the way those enemies play in the video game. Now let's get into the major character-specific differences. Now the Ironclad does not have any significant changes that I could think of outside of how the character is affected by maximums, scaling, and of course the differences with how weakness and vulnerability work. There will be subtle differences with various specific cards, but the character play overall is not changed significantly for the Ironclad. But the defect does have some differences. First of all, you choose which orbs to evoke in the board game rather than next in order. And you choose the target for lightning orb attacks rather than a random enemy. And you choose enemy for darkness orbs as well. While this was likely added to streamline things a bit instead of having to roll a die or use some other mechanism to determine who gets attacked with the random lightning strikes, I like the added agency that this gives players, being able to both choose which orbs to use as well as who to attack. Now, frost orbs do not do extra block when they are evoked in the board game, which I find most unfortunate as it de-incentivizes evoking frost orbs, plus weakens frost some. There are also no plasma orbs in the board game, and cards that used to give plasma production simply give energy. So those are the main differences for the defect. Let's get into the watcher differences. In the board game, being in Wrath at the end of your turn is a single automatic damage, which can be blocked, instead of doubling the enemy's attacks. Some don't like this difference because it is a damage no matter if the enemy is attacking or not, but I find it much more forgiving than doubling all of the enemy's attacks. There is no divinity stance or pressure points in the board game, which I find unfortunate as they are good mechanisms in the video game that I could have seen being utilized in the board game fairly easily. Miracles are not cards in the board game, instead they are tokens, which means they don't count as playing cards for things that would trigger based on card play. Now let's get into the differences for the silent. In the board game, you do not remove poison each round, whereas in the video game, you remove 1 poison from each enemy after applying the damage from poison. There is also a maximum of 30 poison that you can apply across all enemies. And shivs are not cards in the board game, instead they are tokens, which means they do not count as cards, but they do count as a 1 damage attack, just like in the video game. Of course, the biggest difference between the board game and the video game is that the board game can be played with multiple players working cooperatively to ascend the spire. Characters are typically only attacked by enemies in their own row unless the enemy has an area of effect attack, which hits all players. The players, however, can choose to attack any enemy. An area of effect attacks the players have will target a single row. Typically, players can only apply block to themselves, but sometimes players will have cards which allow them to block for other characters. If any player is killed, then the game is over for all players. There is a variation where if a player dies during a boss fight, players can finish the boss fight for the win of that act, but still are unable to continue on into the next act. So there are, of course, other minor changes to the game and quite a few cards that are tweaked in various ways to work differently in the board game. But this is an overview of the major differences that you're going to find between the board game and the video game. There may be a few major differences I failed to think of. Let me know in the comments down below of any I may have failed to mention. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it to be informative, especially if you are familiar with the video game and curious how the board game differs from the original video game version. If you want to know more about how Slay the Spire, the board game, plays, then I encourage you to check out my how to play and partial playthrough with the Watcher right here, or my full playthrough with the Silent over here, or you can check out my full review of Slay the Spire, the board game here. As always, I hope you have a great week and keep on gaming.